He had 4 minutes to decide whether 300 million people would die. Not in a war he could see. Not on a battlefield. In a room 100 feet underground, staring at a computer screen that had just turned red. September 26, 1983, just after midnight. Stanislav Petrov, a 44-year-old lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Forces, was sitting at a desk most people in his own country did not know existed. The facility was called Serpukhov 15, a code name for a bunker complex south of Moscow that housed the Soviet Union's nuclear early warning system. His job was simple. Watch the screens. If American missiles launched, report it immediately to the General Secretary. The General Secretary calls the military command. The military command opens the silos. Soviet missiles launch in return. The whole sequence, from detection to retaliation, was designed to take less than 15 minutes. Here is why that matters. Petrov was not a general. He was not a politician. He was a mid-level duty officer whose authority began and ended with a telephone. But on that night, the system made him the most powerful person on the planet, because the screen in front of him said 5 American intercontinental ballistic missiles had just launched. And protocol said he had to pick up the phone. This is where it turns. If he called it in, the Soviet leadership would not have time to verify. They would not have time to negotiate. They would barely have time to give the order. By the time those missiles reached Soviet soil, the counterstrike would already be in the air. 300 million people in the United States, 280 million in the Soviet Union, hundreds of millions more across Europe, caught in the fallout. All of them depending on a man they had never heard of, sitting in a chair he had occupied for less than a year, staring at a number on a screen that might be wrong. 4 minutes. That is how long Petrov had to decide whether the machine was telling the truth. Here is the part that should terrify you. The system was not built to give him 4 minutes to think. It was built to eliminate thinking entirely. For 2 decades, both superpowers had been refining the logic of nuclear war. The conclusion they reached was brutal and efficient. Speed beats caution. If you wait to confirm that missiles are real before you launch your own, you lose the ability to launch at all. Because by the time the first warhead detonates over your command centers, your communication lines are cut, your leaders are dead, and your missiles sit useless in their silos. The doctrine had a name: Launch on Warning. It meant exactly what it sounded like. You do not wait for the explosion. You do not wait for radar confirmation from multiple sources. You see the launch. You report it. You fire back. Hesitation is suicide. This logic had been embedded in both Soviet and American strategy since the early 1960s. It was taught in training, drilled into officers, encoded in the procedures that governed every step from detection to retaliation. The system assumed that any warning of an American launch was real until proven otherwise. And by the time you could prove otherwise, you would already be dead. So the system was designed to take the decision out of human hands as much as possible. Petrov's job was not to decide whether the alarm was real. His job was to relay the alarm to people who would decide for him. Except on that night, the people above him were asleep, and the screen was screaming. This is the moral imbalance that defines what happened next. The men who built the nuclear system, the generals, the scientists, the politicians, designed it to survive their own deaths. They built machines that could detect, decide, and destroy faster than any human reflex. But they left one weak point: a duty officer, a human being who had to look at the screen and pick up the phone. That weak point was supposed to be a formality, a relay, a step in the chain so fast and so automatic that it barely counted as a choice. Instead, it became the only thing standing between civilization and annihilation. Here is what the screen showed: 0014 hours. 14 minutes past midnight. Petrov was finishing a routine shift. The bunker was quiet. The Soviet early warning system, code-named OKO, had been operational for less than a year. It used satellites in high orbit to detect the heat signature of missile launches. The technology was new. The bugs were still being worked out. But the leadership in Moscow had insisted it be online as quickly as possible. Because by 1983, the Soviet Union was convinced the Americans were preparing to strike first. This was not paranoia. This was doctrinal belief. 3 years earlier, Ronald Reagan had been elected on a platform that called the Soviet Union an evil empire. He had accelerated weapons production, deployed new missiles in Europe, funded a space-based missile defense system that Soviet generals saw as preparation for a first strike. If the Americans thought they could shoot down Soviet missiles after launching their own, the logic of deterrence collapsed. Mutual destruction only worked if both sides knew they would die. So the Soviets built Oko to give themselves more time, more warning, more chance to fire back before the warheads landed. The system was supposed to buy them 25 minutes. That is how long it took for an American ICBM to travel from a silo in Montana to a target in Moscow. 25 minutes from launch to impact. If the satellites detected the launch within 2 minutes, that left 23 minutes for the Soviet command to decide, communicate, and retaliate. In practice, it was less. 2 minutes to detect, 3 minutes to analyze and confirm, 5 minutes to wake the General Secretary and brief him, another 5 to pass the order down the chain of command to the officers who controlled the launch keys. By the time the order reached the silos, there might be 10 minutes left, maybe less. Petrov's job was to shave seconds off that timeline by reporting the moment the satellite saw anything. Not after he had verified it, not after he had checked with ground radar. The moment the screen said launch, he was supposed to pick up the phone, and at 0014 hours, the screen said launch. 1 American missile. Then 5 seconds later, the count updated. 5 missiles. The alarm was not a bell. It was a siren layered over flashing red lights, and a digitized voice repeating the same phrase in Russian. Launch detected. Launch detected. Launch detected. Petrov's staff turned to him. Some were shouting. Others stood frozen. All of them knew what the protocol said. Call it in. Here is where the human cost begins. Stanislav Petrov was not supposed to be in that chair. He was a software engineer by training. His background was in computers, not military command. He had been assigned to the early warning center because someone needed to manage the technical side of the new satellite system. He had been on duty as the senior officer for less than a year. If a more experienced commander had been sitting in that chair, a man who had spent decades trusting Soviet technology, who had been trained to see the Americans as an existential threat, who believed that hesitation meant death, he might have picked up the phone immediately. Petrov did not. He stared at the screen. 5 missiles. The first thing that went through his mind was not fear. It was confusion. 5 missiles made no sense. If the United States launched a first strike, it would not send 5 missiles. It would send hundreds, maybe thousands. The entire American nuclear arsenal at that time included more than 9,000 warheads. The strategic plan for a first strike involved launching enough missiles to destroy Soviet command centers, military bases, and ICBM silos before they could retaliate. 5 missiles could not do that. 5 missiles would kill millions of people, but they would leave the Soviet Union's nuclear forces mostly intact, which meant the Soviet response would annihilate the United States. No American president, no matter how aggressive, would order a suicide strike with 5 missiles. It was tactically insane. That was Petrov's first doubt. The second came from the satellites themselves. The Oko system was new. It had been rushed into service. Petrov had worked on the software. He knew it had glitches. In the past year, the system had thrown false positives during tests. It had mistaken sunlight reflecting off clouds for missile exhaust. It had flagged weather balloons as threats. Every time, the errors had been caught before they reached the level of a formal alert. But Petrov knew the system was not reliable, and this was the first time it had ever declared a real launch. His third doubt came from the ground radar. The Soviet Union had multiple layers of detection. The satellites were the first line. The second line was ground-based radar scattered across Soviet territory. If 5 American missiles were in the air, the ground radar should have picked them up by now. Petrov called down to the radar operators. They reported nothing. No launches, no missiles, no inbound tracks. The satellites said the missiles were real. The radar said the sky was empty. This is the part that makes what happened next almost impossible to understand if you were not there. Petrov had 3 pieces of information. 1. The satellite system, which was designed to be the fastest and most sensitive detector in the Soviet arsenal, was screaming that 5 American missiles were in the air. 2. The ground radar, which was slower but more reliable, showed nothing. 3. The tactical logic of a 5-missile first strike made no sense. He had to choose which piece of information to trust, and he had to choose in less than 4 minutes. Because if the missiles were real, Soviet leadership needed to know immediately. Every second of delay gave the Americans a larger head start. By the time the warheads detonated, it might be too late to launch a counterstrike. If Petrov waited too long to report, he would not just be wrong. He would be a traitor who let his country burn. But if he reported it and the alarm was false, he would trigger World War III. The consequences of being wrong in either direction were annihilation. His staff was yelling at him. Call it in. Report the launch. What are you waiting for? Some of them thought he had frozen, that the pressure had paralyzed him. But Petrov was not frozen. He was calculating. He looked at the screen again. Still 5 missiles. The satellite data had not changed. He called the radar operators again. Still nothing. He checked the trajectory data the satellites were sending. The missiles were supposed to be over the Arctic by now. Radar stations in the north should have seen them. They had not. Petrov made his decision. He picked up the phone. But instead of calling it a launch, he reported it as a system malfunction. His exact words, according to later accounts, were, "I am reporting a system error. False alarm. No launch detected." His staff looked at him like he had lost his mind. One of his subordinates shouted, "You are going to get us all killed." Petrov did not respond. He sat at his desk and waited. Here is what he was waiting for. If the missiles were real, they would reach Soviet airspace in approximately 23 minutes from launch. The satellite had detected them 2 minutes ago. That left 21 minutes. If the missiles were real, the ground radar would pick them up within the next 10 minutes as they descended from their ballistic arc. If they were not real, the sky would stay silent. Petrov waited. 3 minutes passed. 5, 7. The screen still said launch detected. The ground radar still said nothing. His staff was pacing. Some refused to look at him. Others kept glancing at the clock. 10 minutes. Nothing. 15 minutes. Still nothing. At 23 minutes, Petrov exhaled. If the missiles had been real, they would have detonated by now. He had been right. The satellites had lied. Here is what actually happened. The OCO system had mistaken sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds for the heat signature of a missile launch. It was a software error. A false positive. Exactly the kind of Glitcher had warned his superiors about when the system went online. But no one had believed the system would make that error at the worst possible moment. At the exact time when tensions between the superpowers were higher than they had been since the Cuban Missile Crisis. 3 weeks before Petrov sat down at that desk, a Soviet fighter jet had shot down a Korean passenger airliner that strayed into Soviet airspace. 269 civilians died. The Americans accused the Soviets of murder. The Soviets accused the Americans of using the plane as a spy mission. Both sides were on edge. Both militaries were running exercises. Both governments were convinced the other was preparing for war. If Petrov had picked up the phone and reported the launch, the Soviet General Secretary would have been woken and told that American missiles were in the air. He would have had less than 20 minutes to decide whether to launch a counterstrike. No time to verify, no time to negotiate, no time to check with ground radar. Just the word of a satellite system and the knowledge that waiting meant extinction. History does not record what the General Secretary would have done, but the doctrine was clear. Launch on warning. If the alarm was passed up the chain, the system was designed to retaliate. Petrov stopped that alarm with a phone call, not by saying, "I have confirmed this is false," by saying, "I am not convinced this is real." That distinction saved the world. Here is the moral imbalance that defines this story. Petrov was not rewarded. The Soviet military did not promote him. They reprimanded him. His paperwork was incomplete. His log entries were not detailed enough. He had violated protocol by not immediately reporting the alarm. He was quietly reassigned, taken off duty in the early warning center, given a desk job with no authority. The incident was classified. The public did not know. The Americans did not know. For 15 years, the world had no idea how close it had come. Petrov himself did not talk about it, not to his family, not to his friends. He had signed secrecy agreements that would have sent him to prison if he spoke. It was not until 1998, after the Soviet Union had collapsed, that a retired general mentioned the incident in a memoir. Journalists found Petrov. They asked him what had happened. He told them. By then, he was living in a tiny apartment outside Moscow on a pension that barely covered rent. He had suffered a nervous breakdown a year after the incident. He retired early. His wife left him. The man who saved 300 million lives spent the rest of his years in near poverty, unknown to the people whose existence he had preserved. This is where it hits your life. If you were alive in 1983, you did not know that you almost died that night. You woke up the next morning, went to work, watched television, made dinner. You did not know that the reason you are still alive was because one man in a bunker you had never heard of looked at a computer screen and decided not to trust it. If you were born after 1983, you exist because of that decision. Your parents, your grandparents, every person in your family tree who was alive on September 26, 1983, survived because Stanislav Petrov said no. Not no to the Americans, no to his own system. And this decision, to place human judgment above machine protocol, in the 4 minutes when it mattered most, guaranteed what came next. Because the system did not learn the lesson. It did not slow down. It did not add more humans to the decision chain. It did not build in more time to verify. It automated further. The next chapter of this story is not about how we fixed the problem. It is about how we made it faster, more sensitive, and harder to stop. Petrov should never have been allowed to make that choice. That was not an oversight. It was intentional. The nuclear strategists who designed the Soviet early warning system spent years trying to eliminate human judgment from the process entirely. They failed, but not for lack of trying. This is the part that makes Petrov's decision in that bunker seem almost miraculous, not because he was heroic, because the entire system was built to prevent anyone like him from having the chance to hesitate. Here is why one mid-level officer was sitting at a desk with the power to end the world. It was not because the Soviet Union trusted his wisdom. It was because the physics of nuclear war left no other choice. This is where it turns. In 1945, when the first atomic bomb detonated over Hiroshima, the weapon arrived on a bomber. It took hours to fly from the base to the target. Radar operators saw it coming. Air raid sirens went off. People had time to run to shelters, even if those shelters could not save them. By 1960, that window had collapsed. Intercontinental ballistic missiles did not fly at the speed of a bomber. They flew at 15,000 miles per hour. They did not give you hours. They gave you 30 minutes. 30 minutes from the moment a missile left its silo in North Dakota to the moment it detonated over Moscow. That is how long Soviet leadership had to detect the launch, confirm it was real, decide how to respond, communicate that decision down a chain of command, and authorize a counterstrike. 30 minutes to prevent national extinction. The problem was simple. 30 minutes was not enough time for human beings to make decisions the way human beings normally make them. You could not convene the Politburo. You could not call a meeting of military advisors. You could not debate options or weigh consequences. By the time you finished a discussion, the warheads would already be falling. So both superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, arrived at the same conclusion. You had to decide before the missiles landed, which meant you had to decide before you could fully confirm they were real. This logic had a name: launch on warning. It was not a backup plan. It was doctrine. The mechanism worked like this. Satellites in orbit watch for the heat signature of a missile launch. The moment they detect one, they send a signal to ground stations. The ground stations process the data and send it to a command bunker. The command bunker has a duty officer whose job is to evaluate the signal and pass it up the chain. If the officer reports a launch, the message goes to military command. Military command wakes the General Secretary. The General Secretary has minutes, not hours, to decide whether to authorize retaliation. If he says yes, the order goes back down to the launch officers in the missile silos. They turn their keys. Soviet missiles leave the ground. The entire sequence, from satellite detection to launch authorization, was supposed to take less than 15 minutes. 15 minutes to decide the fate of the planet. Here is the human cost of that speed. Every step in the process was designed to reduce the amount of time humans spent thinking. The satellites did not ask whether the heat signature made sense. They reported it. The ground stations did not verify the satellites with independent sources. They forwarded the data. The duty officer in the bunker was not supposed to investigate. He was supposed to relay. The General Secretary was not given time to consult advisors or check with allies. He was given a briefing and a clock. At every stage, the system pushed people to act faster than they could think, because the designers of the system believed hesitation was the real threat. Not American missiles. Hesitation. If you waited to confirm that a launch was real, you lost the ability to respond. Your command centers would be vaporized. Your communication lines would be cut. Your missiles would sit in their silos, useless, while your country burned. The logic was cold and mathematically sound. In a nuclear exchange, the side that hesitates loses. The side that acts first or acts fastest survives. So the system was built to reward speed and punish doubt. That is why Petrov's job existed. Not because the Soviet Union wanted someone thoughtful in that chair. Because the satellites could not pick up a phone. A machine could detect the launch. A machine could process the data. A machine could send the signal. But a machine could not make the call to the General Secretary and explain what was happening. That required a human, not a human who decided. A human who relayed. Petrov was supposed to be a speaker, a microphone for the system. Instead, he became a judge. Here is the moral imbalance that makes this story unbearable to think about too carefully. The men who designed the nuclear system were not stupid. They understood the danger of moving too fast. They knew that satellites could malfunction. They knew that radar could misinterpret signals. They knew that human operators, under pressure, could make mistakes. But they also knew that in a nuclear war, the side that waited to be sure was the side that died. So they made a choice. They built a system that prioritized speed over certainty, and they accepted that the cost of that speed might be a war triggered by accident. False alarms were not theoretical. Between 1960 and 1983, the United States logged more than 100 incidents where early warning systems detected launches that were not real. Satellites mistook the moon rising over the horizon for a missile attack. Radar stations flagged flocks of geese as incoming bombers. Computer errors displayed test scenarios as live data. In every case, someone in the chain of command stopped the alarm before it reached the level of a launch authorization. But every case was a reminder that the system was fragile. One bad satellite reading, combined with one distracted officer, combined with one paranoid general, could trigger a retaliation for an attack that never happened. The designers knew this. They calculated the risk, and they concluded that the risk of accidental war was smaller than the risk of being too slow to respond to a real one. So they built the system anyway. Here is what that calculation meant in practice. It meant that every time a satellite detected a heat signature, someone had to decide whether to trust it. And the system was designed to pressure that person into saying yes. The training manuals were explicit. If the satellite says launch, you report launch. You do not second-guess the machine. You do not wait for confirmation. You report immediately and let the people above you decide. The message was drilled into every officer who worked in early warning. Your job is not to think. Your job is to pass information up the chain as fast as possible. If you hesitate, you are the reason your country dies. Petrov had sat through those training sessions. He knew what the manual said. And when the alarm went off at 14 minutes past midnight, every rule he had been taught told him to pick up the phone and report the launch immediately. He did not. This is where it hits your life. The system was not built for someone like Petrov. It was built for an officer who would trust the machine more than his own judgment. An officer who had spent decades in military command, absorbing the logic of deterrence, believing that the Americans were always on the verge of striking first. An officer who would see 5 missiles on a screen and think, this is it. This is the attack we have been preparing for. If that officer had been sitting in Serpukhov 15 on September 26, 1983, the alarm would have gone up the chain. The General Secretary would have been woken. And history suggests, based on Soviet doctrine, based on the paranoia of the time, based on the lack of any mechanism to verify the satellites in the 4 minutes available, he would have authorized retaliation. The reason that did not happen was an accident of personnel. Stanislav Petrov was not a career military officer. He was an engineer. His job was to manage the software for the OKO satellite system. He had been assigned to the command center because someone needed to understand how the machines worked. He had only been on duty as the senior officer for a few months. He had not spent 20 years absorbing the paranoia of the Cold War military. He had spent 20 years debugging code and learning not to trust systems until they proved themselves. That background saved the world. Because when the screen said 5 American missiles were in the air, Petrov's instinct was not to trust it. His instinct was to ask whether the machine could be wrong. That question was not in the manual. The manual said the satellites were reliable. The manual said ground radar was too slow. The manual said you report first and verify later. But Petrov knew the satellites were not reliable. He had worked on the software. He had seen the bugs. He had read the incident reports from the test phase. He knew the system could mistake clouds for missiles. And he knew that 5 missiles made no tactical sense. So instead of following the manual, he made a decision the system was designed to prevent him from making. He decided to wait. Not wait for orders, not wait for permission. Wait to see if the satellites were lying. This decision violated every rule he had been taught. It put the entire Soviet Union at risk. If the missiles were real, his hesitation gave the Americans an additional 4 minutes of head start. 4 minutes might not sound like much. But in nuclear war, 4 minutes is the difference between a counterstrike that destroys the enemy and a counterstrike that never leaves the ground. If the warheads detonated over Soviet command centers before the launch order reached the silos, the Soviet missiles would sit useless while the country burned. Petrov knew this, and he made the decision anyway. Not because he was brave, because the system had given him just enough authority to destroy himself, and not enough structure to prevent him from thinking. Here's the part that makes the story almost unbearable. The designers of the nuclear system spent decades trying to take human error out of the equation. They built machines that could detect faster than human eyes. They built protocols that could decide faster than human brains. They built chains of command that could act faster than human deliberation. But they could not eliminate humans entirely. Because at the end of every chain, there had to be someone who picked up a phone, or turned a key, or pressed a button. The system tried to make those people into automatons. It trained them to stop thinking. It punished doubt. It rewarded speed. And then it put them in a room where one moment of independent thought could override the entire apparatus. Petrov was that moment. The system gave him 4 minutes to be a microphone. He used those 4 minutes to be a judge. And the judgment he made, that 5 missiles were too few, that new satellites were too unreliable, that ground radar silence was too damning, was the judgment that prevented 300 million deaths. But here is the question the system never answered. What if Petrov had not been there? What if the duty officer that night had been someone who trusted machines more than people? What if the alarm had gone off 3 months earlier, before Petrov had enough experience to doubt the protocol? What if the software glitch had happened on a day when tensions were even higher, when a nervous general secretary was primed to see an American first strike as inevitable? The system had no answer to those questions, because the system was not designed to handle them. It was designed to assume that every alarm was real until proven otherwise. And it gave the people in the chain of command almost no time to prove otherwise. Petrov's decision exposed the flaw at the heart of nuclear strategy. The system was too fast for verification, but too slow for certainty. It trapped the people inside it in a paradox. If you act on every alarm, you risk starting a war by accident. If you wait to verify every alarm, you risk losing the ability to respond to a real attack. There is no perfect answer to that paradox. The designers of the system knew this, so they made a choice. They built a system that leaned toward action, and they accepted that the cost of that choice might be annihilation triggered by a cloud. Petrov refused to accept that cost. For 4 minutes, he held the door shut. But the door is still there, and the system behind it did not slow down after 1983. It sped up, because the lesson the military learned from Petrov's near miss was not "we need more time to verify." It was "we need faster machines so humans cannot interfere." What happened next was not a retreat from automation. It was a sprint toward it. 23 minutes can feel like forever when you are waiting to die. Petrov sat at his desk in Serpukhov 15 and watched the clock. The satellites still said 5 American missiles were in the air. The ground radar still said nothing. His staff stared at him. Some were angry. Some looked terrified. One officer kept repeating the same sentence. "You are going to get us all killed." Petrov did not respond. He had made his decision. He had reported the alarm as a system malfunction instead of a launch. Now he had to wait to see if he was right. If the missiles were real, they would hit Soviet soil in approximately 23 minutes from the time the satellites detected them. 23 minutes for an intercontinental ballistic missile to travel from a silo in the American Midwest to a target in the Soviet Union. If Petrov was wrong, the first he would know about it was when the bunker shook. If he was right, nothing would happen. The clock kept moving. This is where it turns. Most people think the story of that night ends with Petrov's decision not to report the alarm. It does not. The decision was only half the story. The other half was the waiting. Because Petrov did not have proof that he was right. He had a guess. A guess based on 3 things that did not make sense. 5 missiles. No ground radar confirmation. A system that had glitched before. But a guess is not evidence. And for 23 minutes, Petrov had to live with the possibility that his guess was wrong. Here is what those 23 minutes look like. 0014 hours. The alarm goes off. Petrov reports it as a system error. 0015. His deputy commander demands an explanation. Why are you not calling this in? Petrov says, the satellites are wrong. How do you know? I do not know. But the radar sees nothing. The radar is slower than the satellites. That is why we have the satellites. Petrov does not argue. He watches the clock. 0017. 3 minutes since the alarm. If the missiles are real, they are over the Arctic now, traveling at 15,000 miles per hour, burning through the atmosphere on a trajectory that will end in Moscow or Leningrad, or one of the Soviet ICBM fields. Ground radar stations in the northern Soviet Union should be picking them up by now. Petrov calls the radar operators. Anything? Nothing. He exhales. But the exhale does not feel like relief. It feels like doubt. What if the radar is wrong? What if the missiles are traveling on a path the radar cannot see? What if the Americans have developed a new kind of warhead that evades detection? Petrov does not know the answers to those questions. No one in the room does. So he keeps watching the clock. 0020. 6 minutes. Another officer approaches. We need to escalate this. If you are wrong, we are giving them a head start. Petrov knows he is right. If the missiles are real, and Petrov has refused to report them, Soviet leadership will not know until it is too late to launch a counterstrike. The delay is not 6 minutes. It is 6 minutes now, plus the time it will take for the warheads to hit, plus the time it will take for someone to realize the bunker has been destroyed. By then, Soviet command and control could be shattered. The missiles in the silos would be intact. But the people who could give the launch order might be dead. Petrov is gambling the survival of the Soviet Union on his belief that a computer made a mistake. That belief does not feel solid anymore. It feels like arrogance. 0025. 11 minutes. Petrov's hands are shaking, not from fear, from the realization that he has put himself in a position where both outcomes destroy him. If he is right, and the alarm is false, he will be reprimanded for not following protocol. If he is wrong, and the missiles are real, he will be remembered as the man who let the Soviet Union die without fighting back. There is no version of this story where Petrov is a hero. Not to the system. 0030. 16 minutes. One of the junior officers walks out of the room. Petrov does not stop him. He knows what the officer is doing. He is going to find a phone and call someone higher up the chain of command. He is going to report that the duty officer at Serpukhov 15 has refused to pass along a satellite warning. Petrov does not care anymore. If the officer makes that call, Petrov's career is over. If the missiles are real, Petrov's career is over anyway. All that matters now is the next 7 minutes. 0032. 18 minutes. Petrov stares at the screen. The satellites are still showing 5 launches. The system has not corrected itself. If this is a malfunction, it is a persistent one. The kind of malfunction that could fool a computer for half an hour. Or the kind of malfunction that is not a malfunction at all. 0035. 21 minutes. The phone on Petrov's desk rings. It is a commander from a radar station in Siberia. We have been scanning for the last 20 minutes. We see nothing. Are you sure the satellites detected a launch? Petrov feels something unclench in his chest. No, he says. I am not sure. Then why did you put us on alert? Because the satellites said so. But I think they are wrong. There is a pause on the other end of the line. If you are wrong about them being wrong, we are all dead. I know, Petrov says. He hangs up. 0037. 23 minutes. This is the moment. If the missiles were real, they would be hitting now. Petrov does not know where the targets are. The satellites do not provide that level of detail. But somewhere in the Soviet Union, Moscow, Leningrad, a missile field in Kazakhstan, There should be a flash of light, a shockwave, a fireball that turns a city into ash in less than a second. Petrov waits. The room is silent. No one is arguing anymore. They are all waiting for the same thing. 0038. Nothing. 0039. Still nothing. 0040. Petrov stands up. His legs are unsteady. He walks to the radar display and looks at the map of Soviet airspace. It is empty. No incoming missiles. No detonations. No war. The satellites were wrong. Here is the human cost of those 23 minutes. Stanislav Petrov aged a decade in less than half an hour. His staff would later say he looked like a different person when the clock hit 0040. Not relieved, destroyed, because the weight of what he had just done finally hit him. He had bet the existence of his country on a guess. And he had been right. But right did not erase the 23 minutes he spent wondering if he had just killed everyone he knew. Petrov sat back down at his desk. He did not celebrate. He did not call anyone to report that the alarm was false. He just sat there, staring at the screen, trying to process what had almost happened. The satellites continued to show 5 launches for another 12 minutes. Then, at 0052, the system reset. The screen went blank. Then it displayed a new message. System error. False alarm. Petrov wrote it in the log. Satellite system malfunction. Ground radar confirmed no launches. Incident closed. He signed his name, and then he went home. Here is the moral imbalance. The system that put Petrov in that room did not care whether he was right. It cared whether he followed the rules. And Petrov had broken the most important rule. He had questioned the machine. 2 weeks later, Petrov was called into a meeting with his commanding officer. He expected to be commended. He had prevented a false alarm from escalating into a nuclear war. He had saved millions of lives. Instead, he was reprimanded. The paperwork from that night was incomplete. Petrov had not logged every detail of the satellite readings. He had not documented the exact time he called each radar station. His report was missing timestamps for key decisions. His commander told him that if the incident had been real, the lack of documentation would have crippled the Soviet response. Petrov tried to explain. If the incident had been real, documentation would not have mattered. We would all be dead. The commander did not care. You did not follow protocol. That is a problem. Petrov was reassigned. Not immediately. But over the next year, he was quietly moved out of the command center, given a desk job, removed from any position where he would have authority over early warning decisions. The official reason was never stated, but Petrov understood. The system did not want people who thought for themselves. It wanted people who obeyed. And Petrov had proven he could not be trusted to obey. This is where it hits your life. If you were alive on September 26, 1983, you came within 23 minutes of dying, not because of a war, because of a cloud. A satellite in orbit mistook sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds for the heat signature of a missile launch. The system interpreted that reflection as 5 American ICBMs leaving their silos. And the system very nearly triggered a Soviet counterstrike that would have killed hundreds of millions of people. The only reason it did not was because one man in a bunker had the presence of mind to ask a question the system did not want him to ask. Is the machine right? That question saved your life. But the system did not reward it. The system punished it. Because from the perspective of nuclear strategy, Petrov's decision was not heroism. It was insubordination. He had inserted human judgment into a process designed to eliminate it. He had slowed down a system built for speed. He had introduced doubt into a doctrine that depended on certainty. And in doing so, he had exposed the central flaw of the entire nuclear apparatus. The system could not survive people like him. If every duty officer in every bunker started questioning the satellites, the whole logic of launch on warning collapsed. You could not have a deterrent if the people operating it refused to pull the trigger. So the system made an example of Petrov, not publicly. The incident was classified. No one outside a small circle of Soviet military command knew what had happened that night. But inside that circle, the message was clear. Do not be like Petrov. Do not question the machine. Do not hesitate. Because the next time the alarm goes off, it might be real. And if you wait 23 minutes to find out, you will have waited too long. Here is what happened to Petrov after that night. He stayed in the military for 1 more year. Then he had a nervous breakdown. The details were never made public. But people who knew him said he could not sleep. He would wake up in the middle of the night, convinced he had made the wrong decision, convinced that the missiles had been real, and he had let his country die. It did not matter that the alarm had been false. It did not matter that he had been proven right. The weight of those 23 minutes never left him. In 1984, Petrov retired early. He took a pension that barely covered rent. He moved into a small apartment outside Moscow. His wife left him a few years later. He lived alone. And for 15 years, he did not tell anyone what he had done. Not because he was ashamed, because he had signed agreements that made talking about it a criminal offense. It was not until 1998, after the Soviet Union had collapsed, that the story finally came out. A retired Soviet general mentioned the incident in a memoir. Western journalists tracked Petrov down. They asked him what had happened. He told them. And for a brief moment, the world paid attention. A few awards, a couple of documentaries, an interview or two. Then the attention faded. Petrov went back to his apartment. He died in 2017, alone, in poverty, mostly forgotten. The man who saved 300 million lives never got to see the people he saved thank him, because most of them never knew they needed saving. And that might be the cruelest part of the whole story. You can survive a disaster you do not know happened. You can walk around for decades, completely unaware that you almost died. Petrov spent 34 years carrying the weight of that night. The rest of the world spent 34 years not even knowing it had happened. And when the story finally came out, the reaction was not gratitude, it was discomfort. Because Petrov's story forces you to ask a question no one wants to answer. How many other times has this almost happened? How many other nights has someone sat in a bunker, staring at a screen, deciding whether to trust a machine that says the world is ending? And how many of those people made the same choice Petrov did? We do not know, because the systems are still classified. The incidents are still secret. The close calls are still buried in files that will not be opened for decades. But we know this. The logic that put Petrov in that room is still the logic that governs nuclear strategy today. Launch on warning, speed over certainty. Trust the machine unless you have proof it is wrong. And 23 minutes is still not enough time to get that proof. The system that almost killed you in 1983 is still running. The satellites are newer, the computers are faster, but the problem is the same. Machines that detect threats faster than humans can verify them. Protocols that demand action before confirmation. And people in bunkers, sitting at desks, watching screens, waiting for the alarm that might or might not be real. The next chapter of this story is not about what Petrov did. It is about what the system learned from his decision. And what it learned was not to slow down. It was to speed up. Petrov was not the only one. That is the part that should terrify you. September 1983 was not the only time the system almost killed everyone. It was just the time someone finally talked about it. Here is what most people do not know. Between 1960 and the end of the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union logged more than a dozen incidents where early warning systems falsely detected nuclear attacks. More than a dozen times, someone sat in a room like Petrov's and had to decide whether the world was ending. Some of those incidents were caught early. The alarm went off, someone checked, and they realized it was a mistake before it reached the level of a presidential briefing. Others went further, much further. This is where it turns. The most dangerous false alarm in American history happened 12 years before Petrov's night. November 9th, 1979. Just after 3 in the morning, alarms went off at the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, the underground bunker in Colorado that monitored Soviet missile activity. The system said 2,200 Soviet missiles had just launched. Not 5, 2,200. A full-scale first strike. The kind of attack that would obliterate every American city, military base, and ICBM silo in less than 30 minutes. The duty officer at NORAD followed protocol. He called the National Military Command Center at the Pentagon. The Pentagon woke the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The chairman called the president's national security advisor. Within 6 minutes, the alarm had reached the highest levels of the American government. Strategic bombers were put on alert. Missile crews were told to prepare for launch authorization. The president was not in Washington that night. He was traveling, but his aides were preparing to wake him and get him to a secure location where he could authorize a counterstrike. The system was seconds away from recommending a retaliatory launch. Then someone checked the satellite data. The satellites saw nothing. No launches, no missiles, no war. NORAD called back the alert. It had been a computer error. A training scenario had accidentally been loaded into the live system. The software that was supposed to simulate a Soviet attack for a drill had been fed into the real early warning network. For 6 minutes, the United States military prepared to start World War III because someone loaded the wrong file into a computer. Here is the human cost. If that error had happened 3 minutes later, the president would have been woken. If it happened 5 minutes later, he would have been briefed and asked to make a decision. And the decision he would have been asked to make was not, should we investigate this? It was, do we launch? Because the logic of nuclear war gives you no time to investigate. If 2,200 Soviet missiles are in the air, you have maybe 10 minutes to get your own missiles out of the silos before the first warheads detonate and destroy your ability to respond. 10 minutes. Not 10 minutes to think about it. 10 minutes to decide, communicate the decision, and execute the launch. In practice, that means the president has maybe 3 minutes to say yes or no. 3 minutes to decide whether to kill 200 million people based on a computer screen. The system that almost triggered that decision in November 1979 was not some outdated Cold War relic. It was state-of-the-art for its time. And it failed anyway. This is the moral imbalance. The people who built the system knew it could fail. They knew computers could glitch. They knew satellites could mistake clouds for missiles. They knew radar could throw false positives. But they also knew that in a real nuclear exchange, the side that waited to be sure was the side that lost. So they built a system that prioritized speed over accuracy. And they accepted that the cost of that speed was occasional near misses. The November 1979 incident was classified. The public did not know about it for years. When it finally came out, the reaction was shock. People could not believe that the United States had come that close to launching a nuclear war because of a software bug. But the military's response was not to slow the system down. It was to add more checks, more layers, more verification steps, which sounds reassuring until you realize that every verification step takes time. And time is the one thing the system cannot afford. Here is what happened next. 3 weeks after the NORAD false alarm, it happened again. Same system, different error. This time, the computer said a single Soviet submarine had launched a missile at the United States. The alarm went up the chain. Bomber crews scrambled. And then, 6 minutes later, the system corrected itself. Another false alarm. Twice in 3 weeks, the most advanced early warning system in the world had nearly started a nuclear war by accident. The system was not fixed. It was upgraded. Faster satellites, more sensitive radar, better computers. Every improvement made the system faster, but none of them made it more reliable, because reliability takes time. And time is what nuclear strategy cannot give you. This is where it hits your life. If you were alive in November 1979, you almost died twice in 3 weeks, and you had no idea. You went to work. You watched television. You made plans for Thanksgiving. While somewhere in Colorado and Washington, people in bunkers were preparing to end the world because a computer had loaded the wrong file. The Soviet Union had the same problem. Petrov's incident in September 1983 was not the first time Soviet satellites threw a false alarm. It was just the first time the false alarm got far enough up the chain that someone had to make a decision. Here is what we know about the other Soviet incidents. In 1977, a Soviet radar station detected what it interpreted as an American missile launch from a submarine in the Pacific. The alarm reached a regional command center. A commander on duty called Moscow and reported it. Moscow checked the satellite data. The satellites saw nothing. The alarm was downgraded. No one knows what would have happened if the satellites had confirmed the radar instead of contradicting it. In 1981, another Soviet radar system flagged a Norwegian weather rocket as an American ICBM. The rocket was launched from a research station near the Soviet border. It was climbing vertically, which made it look like a ballistic missile. By the time the radar operators realized it was not a threat, the alarm had already been passed to a command center. The center called it off. But for 8 minutes, part of the Soviet military was on alert for a war that was not happening. These incidents were not anomalies. They were features of the system. False alarms were inevitable. The designers knew that. They just believed that the alternative, being too slow to detect a real attack, was worse. So they tuned the system to be hypersensitive, which meant it saw threats that were not there. The assumption was that human operators would catch the errors before they escalated. Petrov proved that assumption was fragile. He caught the error, but only barely, and only because he was willing to violate the protocol that told him to report first and verify later. If a different officer had been in that chair, the alarm might have gone all the way to the General Secretary, and no one knows what would have happened then. Here's the part that makes this story unbearable. We do not know how many other times this has almost happened, because the systems are still classified. The United States will not release detailed records of false alarms until decades after they occur. The Russian government has released even less. What we know comes from leaks, memoirs, and occasional declassifications, which means the incidents we know about are probably not the only ones. They are just the ones someone talked about. How many other Petrovs were there? How many other nights did someone in a bunker look at a screen and decide not to trust it? How many times did the system come within minutes of triggering a war that no one intended? We do not know. And that might be the most terrifying part of the whole story. Because if the system almost failed a dozen times when we were paying attention, how many times did it almost fail when we were not? This is the question nuclear strategists do not like to answer, because the answer forces you to confront an uncomfortable truth. The system we built to prevent nuclear war is also the system most likely to accidentally start one. Here is why. Nuclear deterrence depends on speed. If the enemy thinks they can destroy your missiles before you can launch them, deterrence collapses. They have an incentive to strike first. So both sides built systems that could detect a launch and retaliate before the warheads landed. Launch on warning. The problem is that launch on warning requires you to act before you can confirm the attack is real, which means you are always one false alarm away from catastrophe. The faster the system, the less time you have to catch the error. The more sensitive the system, the more false alarms it generates. You cannot optimize for both speed and accuracy. You have to choose. and both superpowers chose speed. The result is a system that has come within minutes of ending civilization multiple times, not because of evil, not because of incompetence, because of the logic baked into the system itself. Petrov's decision in September 1983 exposed that logic. He showed that the system could be stopped by a single person willing to question it. The response from both militaries was not to add more people like Petrov. It was to remove the human choke point entirely. Here is what changed after 1983. Both the United States and the Soviet Union began developing systems that could detect, decide, and launch with minimal human intervention. The Soviets built a system called perimeter. The Americans called it dead hand. The idea was simple. If a nuclear attack destroyed Soviet leadership, the missiles needed to launch anyway. Otherwise, the enemy could decapitate the government and then destroy the rest of the country without fear of retaliation. So the Soviets built a system that could authorize a launch, even if everyone in the chain of command was dead. Perimeter used seismic sensors to detect nuclear detonations on Soviet soil. If it detected explosions consistent with a nuclear attack, and if it could not reach Soviet leadership, it assumed the worst. The system would automatically send launch authorization to missile silos across the country. The silos would fire without waiting for human confirmation. A machine deciding to end the world. The system was designed to survive the death of the people who built it, and to ensure that no enemy could win a nuclear war by striking first. Perimeter was activated in 1985, 2 years after Petrov's night. It is still operational today. The American version was less automated, but the logic was the same. If early warning detected a large-scale attack, and if communication with the president was lost, preset protocols would authorize a launch. The goal was to remove the possibility of hesitation, to ensure that retaliation happened, even if the humans in charge were vaporized before they could give the order. These systems were sold as a way to strengthen deterrence. If the enemy knows you will retaliate no matter what, they have no incentive to strike first. But they also eliminated the thing that saved the world in 1983, human judgment. Petrov's decision only mattered because he had the authority to stop the alarm from going further. In a fully automated system, there is no Petrov. There is only the machine, and the machine does not hesitate. This is the moral imbalance that defines everything that came after. The system that almost killed everyone in 1983 taught the wrong lesson. It did not teach that machines make mistakes. It taught that humans slow things down. So the solution was not to slow down. It was to remove the humans. Petrov's story became a cautionary tale inside military circles. Not because he was wrong to question the system, but because the system could not afford people who questioned it. If every duty officer started acting like Petrov, launch on warning would not work. The whole logic of deterrence depended on the enemy believing you would fire fast enough to prevent them from destroying your missiles. If you built in too much time for verification, you destroyed your own credibility. So the military doubled down on speed, faster detection, faster communication, faster authorization, and less time for anyone to ask whether the alarm was real. Petrov spent the rest of his life knowing that the decision he made in 1983 was the kind of decision the system was designed to prevent. He was not supposed to think. He was supposed to relay. He thought anyway. And 300 million people lived because of it. But the system did not celebrate that outcome. It treated it as a failure, a crack in the armor, a weakness that needed to be patched. And the patch was automation. Machines that could not be Petrov. Machines that would not hesitate. Machines that would do exactly what they were programmed to do, no matter what a human operator thought. That is the world we live in now. A world where the decision to end civilization has been partially outsourced to software, where the time to verify an alarm has shrunk from 4 minutes to seconds, where the systems are faster, more sensitive, and more automated than ever, and where the only thing standing between us and accidental annihilation is the hope that the machines do not make the same mistakes the Oko satellites made in 1983. Petrov's night proved the system was fragile. What happened next proved that fragility was a feature, not a bug. The Cold War ended. The missiles did not. December 25, 1991. The Soviet flag came down over the Kremlin for the last time. The Soviet Union dissolved. People in the West celebrated. They believed the nuclear nightmare was over. They were wrong. Here is what actually happened. The Soviet Union collapsed. But the Soviet nuclear arsenal did not collapse with it. 15 republics became 15 independent countries. 4 of them, Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus, inherited nuclear weapons. Not just a few warheads, thousands. Russia alone inherited 6,000 strategic nuclear weapons. Ukraine inherited nearly 2,000. Kazakhstan got over 1,000. The command and control systems that had been designed to prevent unauthorized launches were suddenly divided among countries that had just declared independence from each other. Some of those countries were politically unstable. Some were economically desperate. All of them were trying to figure out what to do with arsenals they had not asked for and could not afford to maintain. The mechanism that was supposed to keep nuclear weapons secure, a centralized Soviet command structure, had just shattered into 15 pieces. This is where it turns. The 1990s are remembered in the West as the decade when nuclear fear faded. People stopped building bomb shelters. Schools stopped running duck and cover drills. The term Cold War moved from the present tense to the history books. But while the West was celebrating, the nuclear system was coming apart. Not because anyone dismantled it, because the people who built it no longer existed as a country. Here is what that looked like in practice. In Kazakhstan, nuclear missile silos sat in fields guarded by soldiers who had not been paid in months. In Ukraine, strategic bombers loaded with nuclear cruise missiles were parked on runways protected by fences that had not been repaired in years. In Russia, submarine commanders reported that they could not afford to feed their crews while sitting on top of ballistic missiles powerful enough to incinerate entire continents. The early warning systems, the satellites, the radar stations, the command bunkers were still operational, but the budgets to maintain them had evaporated. Between 1991 and 1995, the Russian military's funding collapsed by more than 70%. Satellite networks went offline for lack of maintenance. Radar stations operated with skeleton crews. Command centers ran on emergency generators because the power grid was unreliable. The system Petrov had worked in a system designed to detect an American launch and retaliate within minutes was rotting. And it was rotting while still loaded. This is the human cost. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the people who operated the nuclear system did not disappear. They were still there, still sitting in bunkers, still watching screens, still holding the keys. But now they were doing it in a country that no longer existed, for a government that could not pay them, with equipment that was breaking down. And they were still responsible for preventing the accidental or unauthorized launch of weapons that could kill hundreds of millions of people. Here is the moral imbalance. The nuclear strategists who designed the Soviet system built it to survive a war. They did not build it to survive peace. The whole structure depended on a stable government with a functioning economy and a disciplined military. When the government collapsed, the system should have been shut down. It was not, because shutting down a nuclear arsenal is not like turning off a light switch. You cannot just walk away from thousands of warheads and hope nothing goes wrong. The weapons have to be disarmed. The missile silos have to be decommissioned. The plutonium has to be secured. All of that takes time, money, and expertise. And in the chaos of the Soviet collapse, none of those things were abundant. So the system kept running, with fraying wires, outdated software, unpaid operators, and the same 4-minute decision window that had nearly killed the world in 1983. Here is where it hits your life. If you were alive in the 1990s, you probably remember it as a time of optimism. The Berlin Wall had fallen. The Soviet Union was gone. Democracy was spreading. The nuclear threat felt like something from the past. But while you were feeling safer, the system was becoming more dangerous. Not because of new weapons, because the old weapons were falling apart in the hands of people who could no longer afford to maintain them. And that created a risk worse than anything the Cold War had produced. The risk of accident. When both superpowers were functional, they at least had the resources to prevent unauthorized launches. When one of those superpowers disintegrated, the safeguards disintegrated with it. This is not hypothetical. On January 25, 1995, Russian early warning radar detected a missile launch off the coast of Norway. The trajectory suggested it was headed toward Moscow. The alarm went up the chain. Within minutes, it reached the Russian president, Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin was handed the nuclear briefcase, the Cheget, a metal suitcase containing the codes and communication links needed to authorize a nuclear launch. For the first time in history, a Russian president opened the Cheget and considered whether to order a counterstrike. The clock was running. If the missile was real, it would hit Russian territory in less than 10 minutes. Yeltsin had maybe 3 minutes to decide. Here is what actually happened. The missile was not American. It was Norwegian. A scientific research rocket launched to study the aurora borealis. Norway had notified Russia about the launch weeks in advance. But the notification had not reached the radar operators. So when the rocket climbed vertically off the Norwegian coast, Russian radar interpreted it as an American ICBM launched from a submarine. The system saw a single missile and assumed it was the first shot in a decapitation strike, an attempt to destroy Russian leadership before they could order a counterstrike. The logic of launch-on warning said Yeltsin should fire immediately. If he waited to confirm the missile was real, he risked losing the ability to retaliate. Yeltsin stared at the Cheget for 2 minutes. Then the radar operators called back. The missile had not turned toward Russia. It was climbing straight up. Scientific trajectory, not a weapon. Yeltsin closed the briefcase. The system stood down. For 8 minutes, the world had been closer to nuclear war than at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And most people alive at the time never knew it happened. Here is the moral imbalance. The Norwegian rocket incident proved that the system had not learned anything from Petrov's night. 12 years after Petrov stopped a false alarm from escalating, the same type of false alarm reached the Russian president and nearly triggered a counterstrike. The difference was not the technology. The difference was luck. Yeltsin happened to wait long enough for the radar operators to call back and correct the alert. If he had been more paranoid, more convinced that the West was trying to destroy Russia in its moment of weakness, he might have authorized a launch. If the call from the radar operators had come 30 seconds later, he might have already made the decision. If the system had been even slightly faster, there might not have been time for a correction. Luck saved the world in January 1995. Not better systems, not better training, luck. And that is the problem. Because when your survival depends on luck, you are not in control of your survival. You are gambling. Every time the alarm goes off, you are rolling the dice and hoping the person in charge waits long enough to realize it is a mistake. Petrov rolled the dice and won. Yeltsin rolled the dice and won. But the dice are still rolling. Here is what changed after the Norwegian rocket incident. Nothing. The system did not slow down. The verification protocols did not get better. The time to decide did not increase. Russia upgraded its early warning satellites. It modernized its radar networks. It improved communication between detection systems and command centers. All of those upgrades made the system faster. None of them made it less likely to mistake a research rocket for a nuclear attack. Because the system is still built on the same logic that nearly killed everyone in 1983. Speed beats caution. Act first. Verify later. Trust the machine unless you have proof it is wrong. And 4 minutes is still not enough time to get that proof. This is where the story becomes unbearable. The Cold War is over, but the weapons are still there. The targeting is still active. The early warning systems are still running. And the decision time is still measured in minutes. Russia maintains approximately 6,000 nuclear warheads. The United States has about 5,500. Most of them are not aimed at each other anymore, but they can be retargeted in seconds. And both countries still keep hundreds of missiles on high alert, ready to launch within minutes of an order, because the logic of deterrence has not changed. If you take your missiles off alert, the enemy might think they can destroy them before you can launch. If the enemy thinks that, deterrence collapses. So both sides keep their missiles ready, just in case. And both sides keep their early warning systems on high sensitivity, just in case. And both sides accept that the cost of that readiness is a system that occasionally screams about attacks that are not happening. The Norwegian rocket incident was not the last false alarm. There have been others. In 2010, an American early warning satellite temporarily lost contact with ground stations. For 45 minutes, U.S. Nuclear Command had no way to detect Russian missile launches. If Russia had launched during that window, the United States would not have known until the warheads hit. In 2007, a Russian radar station briefly reported multiple launches from an American missile field. The alarm was resolved before it reached the presidential level, but it proved that the system is still fragile, still prone to errors, still capable of mistaking glitches for genocide. And here is the part that makes this worse. We only know about the incidents that leaked, the ones that were declassified decades later, the ones someone wrote about in a memoir. We do not know about the incidents that are still classified. We do not know how many other times the system has almost failed. We do not know how close we have come. And we will not know for years, maybe decades, because both governments classify nuclear near misses as matters of national security. They do not want the public to know how fragile the system is. They do not want potential enemies to know how many false alarms they get. They do not want anyone to ask whether a system this unreliable should still be operational. So they keep it secret. And the system keeps running. This is the human cost. Somewhere right now, there's a person sitting in a bunker watching a screen. They are doing the same job Petrov did in 1983, monitoring satellites, watching for launches, waiting for the alarm. If the alarm goes off, they will have minutes to decide what to do. They will face the same impossible choice Petrov faced: trust the machine and risk starting a war by accident, or question the machine and risk letting their country die without fighting back. That person does not know their name will be remembered. They do not know they are sitting at the most dangerous desk in the world. They just know that if the screen turns red, they have to make a decision faster than any human should be asked to make. And we are all betting our lives that when that moment comes, they will be as smart and as lucky as Petrov was. The Cold War ended, but the logic that built the Cold War nuclear system is still governing how we live. We still accept that speed is more important than certainty. We still accept that machines should detect faster than humans can verify. We still accept that the time between alarm and annihilation should be measured in minutes. And we still accept that every so often, the system will scream about an attack that is not real, and someone somewhere will have to decide whether to trust it. Petrov proved the system could be stopped. Everything since has proven that stopping it required a person willing to violate the rules the system was built on. The next chapter is not about what Petrov did. It is about what happens in a world where there are no more Petrovs. A world where the machines are faster than the people watching them. A world where the decision time has shrunk so much that questioning the alarm is no longer an option. That world is not coming. It is already here. The button still exists. It is not one button. It is thousands, scattered across silos in Montana and North Dakota, buried in submarines, cruising beneath the Arctic ice, loaded onto bombers sitting on runways in Missouri and Russia. The weapons that nearly fired in 1983 are still armed. The systems that nearly triggered them are still running. And the logic that built them has not changed. Here is what most people do not understand. When the Cold War ended, the nuclear arsenals did not disappear. They shrank. In 1986, at the peak of the nuclear arms race, the United States and the Soviet Union had a combined total of more than 60,000 nuclear warheads. By 2020, that number had dropped to around 12,000. 12,000 is still enough to destroy civilization multiple times over. But people heard the word reduction and thought it meant safe. It did not, because the weapons that remain are not museum pieces. They are operational, ready to launch, and faster than ever. This is where it turns. The nuclear strategists who survived the Cold War learned the wrong lesson from Petrov's night. They did not learn that human judgment saved the world. They learned that human hesitation nearly doomed it. So they built systems designed to eliminate hesitation. Faster satellites, faster computers, faster communication, and less time for anyone in the chain of command to ask whether the alarm is real. Here is what that looks like in practice. In 1983, Petrov had 4 minutes between the satellite detection and the moment he would have been expected to escalate the alarm. 4 minutes to think, to check the data, to call the radar operators, to make a decision that violated his training but saved 300 million lives. Today, that 4 minutes has shrunk. Modern early warning systems can detect a missile launch within 90 seconds. They can process the trajectory and transmit the alert to command centers in under 3 minutes. Which means the decision time, the window between detection and action, is now shorter than the time Petrov spent staring at his screen. The system has been optimized for speed, not for accuracy, not for verification. Speed, because the logic of nuclear deterrence still says the same thing it said in 1983. If you wait too long, you lose the ability to retaliate, so you cannot wait. Here is the human cost. The person sitting in the modern equivalent of Petrov's chair does not have 4 minutes anymore. They have 2, maybe 3, and in those 2 or 3 minutes, they are expected to relay the alarm up the chain without questioning it, because questioning takes time, and time is the one thing the system cannot give them. This is the moral imbalance. The weapons have gotten more precise. The satellites have gotten more sensitive. The computers have gotten faster. But the fundamental problem has not been solved. The system still cannot tell the difference between a launch and a cloud fast enough to prevent a false alarm from escalating. It just escalates faster now. Here is what that means for you. If you are alive today, you are living under the same nuclear threat Petrov lived under in 1983. The same missiles, the same targets, the same doctrine. Launch on warning, speed over certainty. Trust the machine. The only difference is that the machine is faster, and the people watching it have less time to stop it. This is where the story becomes unbearable, because the system that nearly failed in 1983 has not been replaced. It has been upgraded. Upgraded to do the same thing it did then, but faster, which means it is now more likely to fail faster. Here is why. Every improvement to the detection system makes it more sensitive. More sensitive means it sees more. More means more false positives. More false positives means more alarms. More alarms mean more decisions. And every decision is a roll of the dice. Petrov rolled the dice in 1983 and won. The system has rolled the dice dozens of times since. And every time, we have bet our survival on the person in the chair being as smart, as skeptical, and as lucky as Petrov was. That is not a strategy. That is a prayer. And the system is praying faster now than it was then. Here is what we know about the current state of nuclear early warning. Both the United States and Russia maintain thousands of warheads on high alert. High alert means they can be launched within minutes of a decision, not hours, not days, minutes. The missiles in the silos are fueled and ready. The submarines are on patrol with launch keys in the safe. The bombers are loaded and waiting for the order to take off. All of them are connected to early warning systems that are watching for launches 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And all of them are operating on the same logic that nearly killed everyone in 1983. If you see a launch, you assume it is real until proven otherwise. And you act before you have time to prove otherwise. That logic has not changed. It cannot change. Because if it changes, deterrence collapses. If you take your missiles off high alert, the enemy might think they can destroy them before you can launch. If the enemy thinks that, they have an incentive to strike first. If they have an incentive to strike first, you are not safe. So the missiles stay on alert. The systems stay hypersensitive. And the world stays one bad sensor reading away from annihilation. This is where it hits your life. You do not think about nuclear weapons anymore. Most people do not. The Cold War is over. The USSR is gone. The threat feels distant, historical, but the weapons are still there, still pointed, still ready. And the system that controls them is still making the same mistakes it made in 1983. You just do not hear about them, because the close calls are classified. The false alarms are kept secret. The near misses are buried in reports that will not be released for decades. But they are still happening. In 2018, a ballistic missile alert was sent to every phone in Hawaii. The message was clear. Ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill. For 38 minutes, the people of Hawaii believed they had minutes to live. Parents put their children in bathtubs and covered them with mattresses. Drivers abandoned their cars and ran for shelter. People called their families to say goodbye. For 38 minutes, more than 1 million people thought they were about to die in a nuclear attack. Then a second message arrived. False alarm. An employee at the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency had accidentally triggered the alert during a shift change. It was not a missile. It was a mistake. But for 38 minutes, the people on the ground did not know that. They thought the war they had stopped worrying about decades ago had finally come, and there was nothing they could do but wait. Here is the moral imbalance. The false alarm in Hawaii did not trigger a nuclear launch, but it proved that the system is still fragile, still capable of terrifying millions of people with a single error. And if a state-level emergency alert system can send a false warning to 1 million phones, what makes you think the federal early warning system cannot send a false alarm to the president? It already has, multiple times. We just do not know how many times, or how close those false alarms came to becoming real launches, because the system does not tell us. This is the part that makes the story unbearable. The weapons that almost fired in 1983 are still armed. The systems that almost triggered them are still running. The logic that built them is still in place. And the people responsible for preventing accidental launches are working with less time, more pressure, and the same fragile technology that nearly killed Petrov's generation. Petrov's decision in 1983 proved the system could be stopped. But it also proved that stopping it required someone willing to break the rules, someone willing to question the machine, someone willing to risk their career, their reputation, and their country on the belief that the alarm was wrong. The system has spent the last 4 decades trying to make sure no one like Petrov can do that again. Not by making the system more reliable, by making it faster, so fast that questioning it is no longer possible. Here is what that looks like. Modern hypersonic missiles can travel at more than 5 times the speed of sound. They do not follow the predictable arcs of traditional ICBMs. They can maneuver in flight, change direction, evade defenses, and they can reach their targets in minutes instead of the 25 to 30 minutes a traditional ICBM takes. Russia has deployed hypersonic missiles. The United States is developing them. China is testing them. And every country with a nuclear arsenal is racing to build them. Because hypersonic missiles do not just make deterrence more credible, they make the decision time shorter. If a hypersonic missile launches, the early warning system detects it. But the trajectory is harder to predict. The flight time is shorter. The window to decide whether to retaliate shrinks from minutes to seconds. And in that compressed timeline, there is no room for a Petrov. No time to check the radar. No time to question the satellites. No time to do anything except trust the machine and act. This is the human cost. The world Petrov saved in 1983 is not safer now. It is faster. Faster detection, faster weapons, faster decisions, and faster mistakes. Every improvement to the technology makes the system more capable, but it also makes it more brittle, more likely to interpret an error as an attack, more likely to demand action before verification is possible, more likely to turn a glitch into a catastrophe. Petrov had 4 minutes. The next person in his position might have 4 seconds. And in 4 seconds, you cannot think. You can only react. This is the moral imbalance that defines the world we live in now. The nuclear strategists who built the system wanted to create a deterrent so strong that no one would dare attack. They succeeded. But the deterrent they built is also the thing most likely to destroy us. Not because of war, because of speed. The system is so fast, so automated, so optimized for retaliation, that it no longer has room for the thing that saved it in 1983. Human judgment. Petrov's story is not a reassuring tale about how the system works. It is a warning about how fragile the system is, and how close we have come to dying because of it. The next chapter is not about another close call. It is about what happens when the close calls stop being close, when the system moves so fast that the errors cannot be caught, when the decision time shrinks to nothing, when the button is not pressed by a person anymore, but by a machine that does not hesitate. That world is not hypothetical. It is being built right now.